everyone. Welcome to Exchange Exposed, a quarterly podcast covering on-premises Exchange, Exchange Online, and related technologies. Exchange Exposed is hosted by Exchange MVPs Tony Redmond and Paul Robichaux. This episode is sponsored by Veeam Software. Veeam enables the always-on business by providing solutions that deliver availability for the modern data center. Veeam recognizes the challenges in keeping a business up and running at all times and addresses them with solutions that provide high-speed recovery, data loss avoidance, verified protection, leveraged data, and complete visibility. Founded in 2006, Veeam currently has 25,000 pro partners and more than 101,000 customers worldwide.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of Exchange Exposed. This is Tony Redmond, and sitting beside me is
Paul Robichaux. Hi, everybody.
Oh, great. Okay, so this podcast is intended to be a little bit different to others that you might have heard. We really want to keep things focused on strategic questions that relate to Exchange and all the associated technologies that make up the Exchange ecosystem. In fact, both Paul and I have been writing about this kind of stuff for the last 17 years or thereabouts, which seems an awfully long time, but I guess that just represents the lifetime of the product.
We're old.
Yeah, we're old. Well, we are grumpy old men. Let's just acknowledge that straight off.
True story.
We will try and keep things out of the weeds as much as possible because we would like to keep it at the strategic level, but seeing that we're both nerds and technologists, I guess that's the polite name for nerds, we may just go down into the weeds from time to time, but we'll do as much as we can to drag ourselves back up. We will cover a lot of on-premises content, but clearly the cloud is an enormously important influence today, and so we'll be covering that as well. The intention is that we'll be tracking the 3-month or quarterly cadence for Exchange updates. 4 podcasts a year seem to be sufficient to give us enough time between each of them to develop the kind of topics that we want to talk about and get some information about them. And another thing that we plan to do, and you're going to hear it later on in this podcast, is that we want to integrate sponsor content in a different manner. Typically, sponsor content is in the kind of marketing messages that sponsor companies want to pass. And while those marketing messages are all very valuable, what we really want to do is to ask our sponsors, well, what are the important issues to you? What are you trying to do? What are the challenges that you see in terms of technology in this marketplace over the next year or so? And how are you coping with them? So it'll be interesting to see how our sponsors cope with this kind of questioning because as any of you who know us might realize, our kind of line of arguments and reasoning may not be totally logical from time to time. But that's what we want to do. And to start the ball rolling, I'm going to segue to Paul, who's going to start talking a little bit about the current state of Exchange.
So, when you and I started talking about doing this podcast, Tony, one of the things that we decided was to include a sort of state of the union in each episode, where we talk a little bit about what the Exchange market and Exchange community look like. And so it's great that we've been able to have this first episode recorded at Exchange Connections because we have a lot of fresh material to talk about.
Right. Well, let's start off with the most basic one. What do you think of Exchange 2013 Cumulative Update 6?
Well,
CU6, your favorite topic.
I can tell you what I think about CU6, and I can tell you what I've been hearing from attendees. They don't like it very much.
Why?
A couple of reasons. One is that there is an ongoing perception among a lot of folks that the update cadence is too fast. That because of the speed at which Microsoft is releasing these updates, customers are not able to keep up. Because it takes them longer than 3 months to certify an update as being ready for production, to plan its deployment, and to roll it out globally.
Yeah. It's much different though, isn't it? For Microsoft is doing this because they're trying to stay competitive with Google and the likes, and so their focus is in keeping Office 365 updated. So you have this very, very, very frequent updates going into the service. But it just doesn't work in the enterprise.
Well, not only does it not work in the enterprise, but I think the whole premise of trying to get these updates out quickly is very different than what Microsoft originally envisioned. And the reason I say that, if you look at the roadmap that the Office 365 team has put out, which I applaud, by the way, I think it's great that they have a public roadmap that everyone can see. realizing that not everything that they're going to do is on the roadmap, but it still gives enterprises a chance to see what they should expect. The difference between the rate at which those features are rolled out according to the roadmap and the rate at which bug fixes, patches, and security updates and features get rolled out to on-prem customers, those two are diverging pretty rapidly.
Right.
In the service, Microsoft can choose the time and manner that these updates are applied, and if something needs more baking, they can keep it and delay its release. If something is ready sooner than anticipated, they can put it into the first preview program and give it to people sooner. But enterprises don't necessarily have that option. For large networks of business critical systems where you have things like change windows, if a cumulative update releases every 3 months, that means now some of these companies are in a position where they only have change windows every
6 months.
6 months
Yeah.
at best.
Right.
And so having CU6 come out with its quality issues, which we'll talk about more in a minute, it's really a challenge for companies to try to figure out how they're going to shoehorn a cumulative update in twice as often as their normal processes would allow for.
I think it'd be fair to say that when CU6 first appeared, we had really great hopes because Microsoft does make early builds available to their TAP program. They make them available to MVPs.
Yes.
Yeah, we all install early builds. It looked really good, and it had the promise then of fixing this public folder scalability issue that had dogged the product. But gee,
and I think it's fair to skip back to and say, okay, CU5, CU4, those releases were not up to the standard of quality that we've expected from Microsoft.
right?
I don't think anybody can argue that. You can argue
Specifically the Exchange team.
Yes. I think you can make an argument that the problems that were in those releases were not major or didn't affect every customer with a major impact. But the fact remains that there were flaws unlike what we have seen in the past from the Exchange team.
Do you think that that's reflective of a lack of testing, or is it just just speed?
Hold that thought. I want to circle back to that in a second.
Cool.
I think that given the history of the previous updates, there was a great deal of expectation from customers and a great deal of public commitment from Microsoft. But the Exchange team said, look, we realize the quality is not up to the bar that we believe we should be delivering, and we're going to work on that. So when CU6 was announced, I think the consensus was that Microsoft had turned the corner in the quality of its delivery releases for Exchange, and that everybody would be able to install this release and have a good quality experience. And that's clearly not what happened.
No, I mean, just going down through the list, we've had hybrid connectivity issues, a problem there, and that was kind of surprising. But that was, to be fair to the Exchange group, I think we now know that was a change made in the service in Office 365 that suddenly killed hybrid connectivity, the wizard.
Right.
Which is surprising, by the way, because, when you think about it, hybrid connectivity is a jewel in Microsoft's crown.
The one thing that you would think that an Exchange update would preserve would be the ability to go hybrid and move mailboxes to the cloud, because it's such a business focus of what Microsoft is doing.
It's a huge advantage of them against Google, for example. Google can't do this hybrid stuff. Microsoft can. So I agree with you. I think they should have been really careful with hybrid connectivity. So that failed. Then we had the compliance issue with OWA, where we suddenly found out that you could get rid of items without them being preserved.
Well, the compliance issue is interesting because it seems to have been in the product for a while.
Right.
So why didn't anybody notice that before?
Because nobody actually went to check whether or not items were being preserved.
Exactly.
Right.
So,
and it took a customer to find this out.
I guess that's maybe my question could be construed in two ways. One is, why didn't customers notice this before? Does that say something about the uptake of that particular feature? But it's clearly something that I think should have reasonably been detected by Microsoft during their testing. So to go back to your point earlier in asking, why are we seeing this upsurge in quality issues? Is it because of the speed? Is it because of the change in testing? I'm not sure that you can generalize to a single cause. And the reason I say that is that some of the things that we've seen have only affected on-premises customers. And so I think you could make the argument, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with it, but you could make the argument that there has not been enough testing given to unique on-prem configurations.
Yeah, just going back to the OWA compliance issue, my take on it was that why wasn't this fault found report before? I think two reasons. The first thing is it's an OWA-only problem. If you don't use Outlook web app and use Outlook instead, which I figure most of the major players who are involved in compliance and legal discovery and the need to preserve items, I reckon most of those guys are using Outlook on the desktop and they're using an ActiveSync client or a BlackBerry as their mobile device.
Fair point.
Right? So this problem wouldn't have shown up there. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which is actually a bit of a heads up for people who are involved in these type of compliance efforts, is that maybe people weren't looking. They weren't checking that that these holes were actually working. Right. So that's probably a thing for them to look at. But the other set of issues that really had me scratching my head were these ones with Exchange 2007 coexistence.
You would think by now that coexistence would be one of the more mature parts of the product, given that it's been around for a while.
Right, and we had two particular issues. One was when you had databases going offline, which, as we understand today, is all to do with delegate access. Now, so you had this delegate on an Exchange 2007 mailbox server was just trying to make access to a mailbox on a 2013 server, and bang, the 2013 database said, no, you can't do that. You're interfering with me in a way I don't want. I'm going to go offline.
Seems a bit of an overreaction.
It seems a bit of an overreaction. But you know what? One thing that strikes me is that underlines the best practice that a lot of us have been talking about over the years, which is that when you move mailboxes to a new version of Exchange, you move all the mailboxes that are involved in a delegated scenario.
All the forward and backwards delegates go along with the mailbox when you move it.
Absolutely. The one that really got me going, though, was this ActiveSync one. You've got these users coming in, they hit an Exchange 2013 CAS, and bang, there's no proxy available to the 2027 mailbox. That seemed to be a thing that should have been picked up in testing.
Every customer who has Exchange 2007 on-prem is guaranteed to run into that, because Microsoft's recommendation for years has been that you always route all traffic through the latest version of Exchange you have installed, because new versions know how to proxy to older versions, but not vice versa. So it's hard for me to understand how they could not have noticed that in testing, unless, for whatever reason, they didn't test that particular configuration. Now, this goes back to the question you were asking earlier. Is it a lack of attention? Is it a lack of resources? I don't know the answer. I mean, obviously, I'm not privy to all the details of how Microsoft allocates test and engineering hours across different parts of the product and across different releases. But it's certain that to me is a great example of something that you would reasonably expect would have been caught by automated testing. Because the fact that it didn't get caught.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing that comes to mind here is, of course, that this is again in an area where Microsoft have traditionally been strong, and it's an area that traditionally has gained them an awful lot of customer loyalty, because you have had the ability to have coexistence with previous versions and seamless coexistence with previous versions. So it's just very, very, very odd to me, this one.
Well, it's a little disappointing too, in that, as you say, coexistence has become one of the key selling points for Exchange, and it was not always that way. Right. There was a time when upgrading from one version of Exchange to another was a big traumatic experience. Lotus, for example, used to highlight what they would disparagingly refer to as rip and replace migrations. But we got to a point now where putting a new version of Exchange in is very straightforward. You install the new servers, you point your traffic to flow through those servers, and then moving users is as simple as moving mailboxes. It's a very mature, very stable process. And so anything that interrupts that coexistence is serious.
So what's your take on this, the Chrome issue that came to light recently? When Google updated Chrome 37 and all of a sudden they removed the show modal dialog method, which has been around since IE4. I think that's when it was first introduced. And there's actually part of the HTML draft specification that's gone to the W3C. But Google, for reasons they say for security and because they don't like it very much, and they don't think people were really using it, they removed it. It promptly caused problems for OWA and EAC. What's your take on that?
So you know that I am certainly no fan of Google's for a variety of reasons.
Aren't you on Mountain View's Christmas card list?
Yes. Mountain View is going to be sending me some kind of package in the mail, but I doubt it will be a Christmas present.
As long as it's not leaking noxious fluids, you'd be all right.
Or an Android device. I think I'd rather have the leaking fluids than an Android device, but that might just be me. So moving right along. Returning back to the former tone of class we had established.
Yes, let's talk about Chrome 37.
I don't necessarily think that I know exactly where to apportion responsibility in this case. Because on the one hand, internet standards are dynamic and they evolve over time. So I think Google is well within their rights to say, we are not going to continue to support this ancient extension. I'm okay with that. At the same time, Google has a pretty good track record of announcing how they're going to change the APIs and internet standards that they support. And in fact, there was a case not long ago where they announced that they were no longer going to support the use of Exchange ActiveSync for Gmail in some circumstances.
Yes.
That caused a big uproar that eventually got resolved after a fashion. So they have a good track record of telling people what they're going to do before they do it. So what's not clear to me at this point is, what did Microsoft know and when did they know it? When did the OA and ECP teams become aware that this API was going away? Or did they, were they aware of it at all? It's possible that maybe it just slipped below their radar and they were not aware that the change was going to be made. But
yeah, I'm somewhat dubious on that, because I think the first thing I should say up front is I think Google used bad data in making this decision. They came up with this phony figure of 0.06% of total web pages that they observed actually used show modal dialog.
Right.
Whereas they then admitted that, well, you know what, enterprise apps we can't really measure because we can't see inside firewalls. And when you think about it, all of the traffic for OWA is either inside a corporate firewall because it's going to an on-prem server, or it's across the internet and ends up in a Microsoft server in Office 365.
Right.
And I don't think Microsoft gives Google that type of data. They may.
Couldn't they have just asked NSA? I mean,
they could have asked the NSA. Yeah, that would have been a good thing. But the point is, though, even though I think Google's data was flawed, in their defense, they have been pretty open since about April 10, I think. They have started to discuss this, and they told people in their Google groups, if you use Google groups, that is, here you go, we're going to get rid of this. And then on July 16, they came out with a pretty formal statement on the Chrome blog to say, it's gone.
And one of the things that interests me about this whole process is Microsoft's IE team does exactly the same thing. When they choose to deprecate a function, they make an announcement into the community in some form or another. They document it on their blog, and then they release an update that deprecates or removes that functionality. So it's not as though this is something unique to the way that Google does business. Mozilla does it with Firefox. Microsoft does it with IE. Presumably Apple does it with Safari. So maybe it's indicative of a process issue on the development side, where the people who need to know about these changes are not plugged in to the source of the changes. I can't imagine that the OA team would have looked at this forthcoming change and said, well, we don't care if users on Chrome can't access these services. It doesn't seem like a rational decision.
Seem like a good thing.
So I don't think that's
so it seems like Microsoft dropped the ball here, but Google is also very much to blame in terms of this acceleration of the deprecation when enterprise apps were identified, I think, in some of their groups that, this could have a problem. Right. But to be a little bit more positive, what do you think about the public folder scalability changes in CU6? That's a good thing.
I think it's a great thing, and I have customers that have been blocked on moving to modern public folders because they couldn't have as many public folders as they needed. And the root, it's kind of the root cause of the problem is that when you start having a conversation with people about triaging the contents of public folders, that discussion almost never goes well because nobody wants to do that.
Right.
Nobody wants to go through their 200,000 public folders and figure out how to boil them down to the 5,000 that people are actually using. They would much rather just move everything over and spend as little administrator time as possible. And to be fair, it's hard to triage these things because the administrators who are responsible for providing the infrastructure for the public folders, they don't know what's in those folders.
Right.
In many cases, those folders are so old and have contents in them that are not owned by anyone still at the company. The people who created the content are gone. Right. So there's no one to ask, hey, do we really need this folder of expense reports from 1999?
Yep.
It's easier just to move everything over and not disturb the status quo.
Yep.
But the downside of that is that if you had a moderate to large public folder deployment, then you were blocked until these improvements hit.
So you can now move 100,000 folders.
I would hope that would be enough, but I'm reminded of the Bill Gates quote about 640K should be enough, or the Thomas Watson quote about how many computers there would be in the world.
Well, I watched Siggy Jagat talking here at Connections about his favorite public folder customer was 300,000 public folders. They're going to have to wait a little bit, and they have some large numbers of terabytes of information to move, which will be an interesting thing to see how MRS, the Mailbox Replication Service, which processes public folder migration requests, it'll be interesting to see just how long that puppy takes.
A little at a time. I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say that the public folder scalability enhancements are a really good example of something that the Exchange team has done a very good job of over the last, I'm going to say, 2 years or so. They got very clear customer feedback that those limits the existing limits were not acceptable.
Right.
They said, we hear what you're saying. We don't know how we're going to fix it yet, but we will.
Yep.
They went away for a while, then they came back and said, okay, here's what we're going to do, and then they did it. Oh. So they have gotten much better at executing on the customer feedback that they're getting, which makes me wonder, what's going to happen with CU7 and in the future? Are they going to be able to continue doing that?
Well, I guess, with the cadence that we know, it's easy enough to anticipate that CU7 is going to land sometime in November 2014. And then, of course, next year, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if Microsoft announced it formally at TechEd in Barcelona at the end of October. But next year we expect Exchange vNext. Now, I've been calling it Exchange 2016 for the last couple of months, mostly because it seemed like, they delivered 2013 in October 2012, and they just added an extra one to the year. So if they deliver Exchange vNext in October 2015, it will be Exchange 2016. And of course, as we look forward to that, I just wonder what we're going to see in this release. I have some ideas. I think, firstly, that you'll see an increased focus on automation. We saw a huge increase in automation with things like managed availability in database auto-reseed in Exchange 2013. But the reason why I think there's going to be an even bigger increase in automation and also an attention towards simplification, which was another trend that we saw in 2013, is that all of these things help in the economics and the operations of running Office 365. Right. Now, one of the things we heard at the Exchange conference in April was that Microsoft has 100,000 servers running Exchange right now in the cloud. In fact, that figure is probably well outdated. They probably have more now.
Sure, that was months ago, so I figure they've
right. And talking to Jeffrey Snover here at Connections, who's the architect of PowerShell, we were just talking about, Office 365 could not be possible without PowerShell.
No.
It would be impossible to run such a huge, massive environment without automation. And the automation is performed through scripting in many cases. But they've got to move from script automation to automation being built right into the product. I think they made a good start of that with managed availability in 2013. And I think we'll see a lot more of that in the next release. Is that then the next question that comes into your mind, is this a good thing for the on-prem administrator?
Well, I guess we like to talk about how improvements that are made primarily for the service end up rolling forward to on-prem. And I think there's some reasonable debate to be had about, are we getting everything on-prem that could be delivered? Are there things that are going to stay exclusive to the service for technical reasons that people want? Those are all interesting things to talk about, but I think it's fair to say that from a perspective of high scale, Microsoft is doing a lot of things to enable Office 365 that don't necessarily benefit on-prem customers. And when I say Microsoft, that's a deliberate choice of words. I didn't say the Exchange team, because there are improvements or changes, if you will, across the entire platform that facilitate 365. Azure AD is a great example.
Right.
That has very limited benefit for on-premises customers who don't want to have DR or identity federation into the cloud. If they want to keep their AD on-prem, I'm hard-pressed to think of any changes that Azure AD has introduced that are useful to on-prem customers.
Yeah, I take your point on that, but I'll push back a little bit, because I do think that simplifying Exchange and increasing the amount of automation that's in the on-prem version is a very good advance. And I like that a lot.
I will agree with you up to a point. It is, from a technical standpoint.
But also for an operational standpoint.
From an operational standpoint, what I see, and I'll give you this feedback from the managed availability session I did yesterday, there are a lot of customers who are completely baffled by managed availability because of the way it behaves and because they don't understand what it's for. And when you explain to them that this is a data center technology that they happen to be getting for free in the product, once they understand what it does and how it works, they become much more receptive. But until that point, they don't perceive it as a benefit. They perceive it as something that is taking action behind their back that they don't necessarily like.
Yeah, I take that point. I think managed availability, there's no doubt about it, is a black box at the moment.
Yes.
It's a black box that makes, on the surface, some arbitrary decisions that nobody can explain, but makes sense in terms of the little world as seen by managed availability. But 2 points I'd make to you. First, I think this is a version 1 release. Okay?
Of course.
And I think what you're seeing is, in the on-prem version, you're seeing managed availability, which works really well for Office 365, doesn't work so well for on-prem. So I expect them to do something about that in 2016. I really do. I expect them to, I heard you yesterday when you were talking about managed availability, saying that the system, you call the event log is the user interface for managed availability. So clearly they've got to get away from that situation. That's stupid. That is absolutely stupid.
Well, except if the design rationale behind managed availability is to have servers fix themselves and do a lot of consolidated roll-up into something like SCOM, then having the event log be the user interface is fine, because out of those 100 and however many thousand servers Microsoft has, nobody is ever going to individually manipulate those servers.
I don't buy that for one reason, Paul, and this is the reason. Managed availability dumping a whole pile of stuff, unfiltered, and with badly formatted, with text that doesn't make sense a lot of the time, into the event log is just a recipe for a disaster. Because all you got then is administrators looking at it and saying, I don't understand this, and then potentially making bad decisions.
But it's not for administrators to look at. That's why it is the way that it is.
Well, that's one perspective, but we know that administrators will.
Yes,
and
that's true.
Right. And the other thing is that you're going to have all sorts of tools that are out there, some homegrown, some commercial ISV products that attempt to make sense of the event log for administrators.
Right.
Right? So they get all this hoo-ha coming out of managed availability. They get masses, thousands and thousands of events. How are they going to make sense? So on the one hand, I hope Microsoft takes the opportunity in 2016 to give us a user interface to manage availability, which is simple, reasonable, straightforward to use. On the other hand, I'm thinking to myself, oh, gee, maybe this is a commercial opportunity for a couple of software ISVs that might just move into this space.
Well, I think it's clearly a commercial opportunity, and one that Microsoft may or may not exploit themselves. But we already have a very simple, easy-to-use interface to manage availability. It's called the Office 365 Service Dashboard.
Oh, yeah.
Red, yellow, green, that's what that is for. So I think you're absolutely right that one of the key improvements we're going to see, and I started mentally thinking of it as Exchange 365, because having Exchange with a product number or a year number and then Exchange online as part of Office 365 is needlessly confusing. And I think that if Microsoft is going to move to this model where they continuously or frequently update things, they might as well ditch the years altogether. But who knows? We'll have to wait.
Who knows? Yeah. Well, that's a marketing decision, and neither of us are marketeers.
Exactly.
What do you think? Do you think they're going to bring out a new version of Outlook?
I hope so. I mean, I think.
So what will happen there? Why do you hope so? You sounded so passionate. You must really love Outlook 2013.
Outlook 2013 has been very stable for me, and it has a lot of features in it that I have wanted for a long time. I love being able to have multiple Mappy accounts in a single container. The calendar, multiple calendars and the calendar overlay and side-by-side views on a wide monitor is super useful. So I'm not displeased with what Outlook does. But there are a number of functions and features that are coming in the service that Outlook can't take advantage of. There's no people view. There's no announced support for clutter. Yeah. Some of these other features that we're going to be getting in the service, and maybe, with luck, on-prem, Outlook is going to have to be able to accommodate.
So do you think that they would bring out a version of Outlook that would integrate Delve, for instance? Because all right, we're only seeing Delve, the first version of it coming out reasonably recently, and it's using this card interface, which by the way is used by other independent products outside of Microsoft. But it's a card interface that shows you items, be it a document, a spreadsheet, whatever,
Right.
that are interesting to you. Now that's totally detached from Outlook today, but the point that I would make is that there are an awful lot of people who work in corporations, which is where I think Delve is naturally going to make the most impact, who spend their entire working life inside Outlook.
Yes, and the Outlook product team has worked very hard to make that possible by providing APIs that let you pull
Oh yeah, all
key
that
performance.
useful Facebook data.
Well, leaving that aside, if you view the Outlook team's goal as to increase the percentage of time that people can productively spend in Outlook without having to go someplace else, they've been very successful making it a development platform. Yep. I think that's likely to continue, so I would expect to see some way to ingest data from Delve and display it in Outlook, even if that's just a web view that pops up in a side pane or something along those lines. But the way that you do it now, with having Outlook open in its own window and then a browser window open for that and another browser window or tab open for Yammer, I think that's one of the major improvement areas that Microsoft can deliver in a future release of Outlook.
I hope they don't have a web view.
I hope they don't too. That would be the cheap and cheerful way to do it.
Cheap and cheerful.
They can do better than that.
And I'd also like them to have some sort of offline access as well, which I think would be really powerful. But I guess we'll see. So one question, it's come up here at Connections, is how soon do you think Microsoft is going to lose interest or focus on the on-prem servers?
How do we know they haven't already?
Oh, there's a pregnant question.
I mean, maybe that's being judgmental, and I don't think that's entirely a fair question because.
But it's a question people are asking.
It is definitely a question people are asking.
And especially when they saw Delve coming out, and there's no prospect of Delve appearing anytime soon. It appears in the on-premises market.
Well, I can see Delve as being an example of something almost like Active Directory rights management or Exchange Online Protection, where you subscribe to a service that delivers Delve in addition to the on-prem services that you maintain. So at first I was really unhappy that
that really means that you're looking for a very, very big expansion of hybrid connectivity,
well,
surely.
That's true. There's a lot of work to be done in hybrid SharePoint in particular before Microsoft could begin to deliver that. I'm just saying that in terms of that particular service, not having it on-prem, I can see that there might be a route to adding that as a value add for people who don't necessarily want to put all of their services in the cloud. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, there are a number of other touch points for services that are being designed and proposed for the cloud that may not have any route to come on-prem because of their scale.
Well, it seems to me that some of these software engineering projects that Microsoft is undertaking right now are only possible because they have total control over every aspect of all of the components that are required to come together.
Absolutely.
I just wonder whether it's possible, to give an on-prem administrator the task of combine and mix and match all of these various information flows in such a way with precisely the right software versions gathered from all across a corporation to bring it together into a product like Delve.
Well, I think there are two different discussions to have there. One is that there are some product features, and Delve is a great example, that are complex by their nature. They have a lot of moving parts or a lot of different components that all have to be kept flying in formation. My argument there would be, is that really any more complicated than running, say, an Exchange 2000 cluster? Maybe it is.
Oh, maybe it is. I mean, have you ever tried to combine SharePoint and Exchange?
Yeah.
And? Did you enjoy the experience?
There's some room for improvement there.
Yeah, like automation and maybe less manual intervention.
Oh, there's clearly.
Did you know the magic words that were required to make the integration work?
I had to look them up.
You had to look them up. Okay. Would you find them on Harry Potter's Book of Wizarding Magic or something?
I'll never tell.
Okay.
But so I think the precedent has been set for having these complex multi-source or multi-vendor. If you think about having to keep all your HBAs consistent with the right version of firmware and the right version of firmware in your servers, it's a pain. It's a lot of hassle. It's a lot of expense and trouble, but it is doable. But the other thing, or the other avenue that's I think is worth talking about, is where we have services such as Clutter. Because Clutter is machine learning based, there's a lot of value. It's almost like message hygiene in that the more people you have participating, the better it gets at predicting and analyzing.
Oh, it's a little bit different because remember that that Clutter is specific to the individual. I take your point about spam detection and stuff like that.
Clutter is individual specific, but I would bet a nickel that it's being seeded so that the initial values that Clutter uses are coming from a compendium of data where people say, okay, well, I routinely read the New York Times news summary, or I always ignore this.
Yeah.
They've got to have some initial values that I think are probably shared. But
yeah. And clearly that's got to be distributed out.
I want Clutter badly. I really do.
You get that much mail?
I get enough of it that I want to be able to very quickly focus on the things that are important.
I feel so undervalued then because I either don't get enough mail for Clutter to be important, or I'm able to deal with it myself.
I think it's probably that you're better at dealing with it.
I delete a lot of mail unread. But anyway, moving quickly along, it's time for our sponsors slot. So joining us on the line, we have Rick Vanover from Veeam, who's going to talk to us about the trials and tribulations of working to bring great virtualization solutions to the Exchange world. Hello.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on.
So what are you guys up to? What news can you tell us?
Well, it's availability. That's what we're head down with right now. And, when it comes to Exchange, I think there's a natural expectation from companies of all sizes that it needs to be made available. And, we hope people want to keep Veeam as part of their strategy for their data center availability.
So what kind of technical challenges are you taking on at the moment?
Well, specifically for the Exchange customer, the challenge I see people trying to tackle today is really the design, right? Like any application, if you don't design it well before you implement and know what you're going to do without keeping in mind what you're trying to accomplish, it's setting itself up for a less than optimal solution. So what I see people today doing is really taking their Exchange design and balancing all factors, the infrastructure they use, if they've gone physical, if they're thinking about virtualizing, if they have a cloud strategy or a hosted Office 365 element of their implementation, and then specifically things like backup, right? All those different things have to go into a design, and there's no cookie cutter design that works for all organizations.
Sure. So the Microsoft guys have this thing about Exchange native data protection, where they talk about the fact that you can get rid of backups. I guess that is not something that many of your customers share. That particular view, is that correct?
I wouldn't say necessarily. I see a lot more people going belt and suspenders. Two ways of holding the pants up. And what I mean by that is, maybe I'll use native application techniques for redundancy and availability. But, there are still plenty of things that can go wrong. All it takes is one bad script from PowerShell, and I've got nothing but evidence that, those scripts do work well on the delete option, okay? Those types of things are real risks today. And it's kind of like one of those multi-level availability approaches. So, arguably many people have Exchange as their most critical application. You get 20, 30 people in a room. Everyone will agree that Exchange is the most consistent critical app, and their needs are different. So maybe it needs to be protected off-site. Maybe it needs to be offline. Maybe it needs to be archived. Maybe it needs data deduplication for way back retention. All kinds of different requirements come in play, and application availability can be part of it. Sure, I have customers that don't use Veeam to back up Exchange and use Veeam to back up everything else, but they might even do things like replicate or send it to a cloud. There's a lot of ways to protect, and just like there's no single way to design, there's also no single way to protect.
Sure. So do do you want to give people a quick overview on how you do take Exchange backups? Because I think this is an area of some confusion at times, especially in the world of virtualization. It's pretty straightforward, I think, when you get physical servers, but because of all the stuff about snapshots and that kind of thing in a virtual environment, some people get confused about it. So you want to just give a 10-second, a 1-minute primer on this?
Yeah, sure, because that's a very important question. Again, throwing it into the wrong arrangement is not the right way to go. But how the Veeam processing engine works for something like Exchange is we prepare the application with VSS, and that also includes the guest file system and the guest Windows environment. But most importantly, the Exchange application is properly prepared through a VSS requester that we've made. That framework, VSS, is made to do things like backup. And when you talk about the native availability techniques like a DAG group in Exchange, we've got resources where we tell people, okay, use both. But if you're using DAG groups and you want to use Veeam, we recommend people back up a passive node. That way it's not going to cause any unexpected failovers, and then you can still get all the benefits of our recovery, which include very specific things like items and notes and contacts and emails and whole databases and the lot. But we simply prepare it through VSS. We'll take either a Hyper-V shadow copy of the whole virtual machine or a VMware snapshot, immediately resume the VSS bits, and then lastly remove that shadow copy and remove that Hyper-V shadow copy. So sequentially, it's generally pretty clean, but above it all, it has to be application aware. So and then implemented in the DAG discussion to the passive node is kind of the short answer of the best way to move the data without causing issues downstream.
So Rick, one of the things that you were just talking about there, you concentrate on the passive node when the mailbox servers are arranged in a DAG. I assume that the technology is capable of dealing with a situation where a passive database is suddenly activated in the middle of a backup.
Oh, yeah. So if the passive node is activated because the active node is backed up, in most situations, that's not expected behavior, right? So, we've got KBs, we've got resources, and, a lot of times people call when that happens. But basically, we try to point people to backing up the passive node to simply it's cleaner. And the logic here is not that we'd ever put the passive node back, right? Well, we want it. That's one thing we can do, but that's really assuming that the other two nodes have gone. We want to make sure you have the full arsenal of recovery. So right now there's, I think, 26 different ways you can restore from that one backup that I described. Now, that could be put the whole virtual machine back, but it might be let me mount that Exchange database and do my command line tools. It might be let me run it and just pull out an email message. So a lot of ways out of the problem once we've created that backup.
Well, I guess, Rick, I'm still curious about what happens in the case where you are correctly backing up the passive node, right? So the administrator has configured things in accordance with what you expect, but then a failure occurs on the active node, which turns the passive node or the passive copy of that database, makes it activate while you're in the middle of a backup. What would happen then?
So in that situation, there's a small window of time where the passive node is prepared to be backed up. It's on larger environments, probably around a minute, and then from there, smaller environments goes less than that. So that moment of VSS quiescence on the passive node would really just make the failover pause until that's done, because the Exchange application never stops, right? We quiesce through VSS, which is more like a pause than a stop, and then once the data starts moving, we actually resume. So, and that's both on VMware and Hyper-V. So really it would just kind of have the passive node after the VSS point, which is only that 1 minute time, right? That the real kind of hairy point would be during VSS quiescence. When the passive node would resume and decide it needs to become active, once it's resuming, it would actually make that decision.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
So, Rick, another thing that's in my mind is you may not or may not be able to answer this kind of question. What's the most common restore scenario that you guys see with Exchange? I mean, is it that it's a complete server, or is it just a single disk, or, as you said there, individual items? What do you think most people are using Veeam for?
For an Exchange server, if people are going to do a restore with Veeam, it's by far an item, an email, or an entire mailbox. Now, that's not the same when it comes to general purpose VMs or general purpose applications. They usually do whole VM restore. But luckily, we have kind of a different, I don't want to say enlightenment mode, but a different cognizance when it comes to Exchange, and that's really by this tool called Veeam Explorer for Exchange, which will crack open the EDB and then do that item level restore quite easily. And the beauty here is you don't have to be an expert in tools like Xmerge and all the great Exchange PowerShell tools to do this.
So, Rick, Paul and I spent some time earlier on in this podcast talking about what we expect to see coming over the next year or so. Specifically, there'll be a new cumulative update of Exchange coming in November, and then we expect to see a major new version towards the end of next year, towards the end of 2015. How do you guys plan for those type of changes that occur in the ecosystem? I mean, do you find it difficult to keep up to date with the cadence that Microsoft has established for Exchange 2013?
For the critical apps, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, I believe we do a good job in the cadence, and let me explain the methodology. In fact, we get a lot of criticism for that great tool I talked about, Veeam Explorer for Exchange. We get a lot of criticism because it doesn't support Exchange 2007. We didn't even have a backup product in 2007. So when we release a feature, we release it with awareness of the products in the market at the time. So Veeam Explorer for Exchange was released in late 2012. So we supported 2010 and then 2013, and we expect to support onward. A good example of how we address these types of updates, because there's a lot of systems in play. There's VMware versions, there's Hyper-V versions, there's Windows, newest Windows Server, there's our integration with storage systems, there's our cloud partners. There's a whole lot of things that have their own APIs and things to work with. I'll give you an example from the SQL Server realm, because we just saw SQL Server 2014 come out recently. Veeam version 7 came out last August. We addressed SQL 2014 support with a patch 3 or patch 4. I can't remember which one. But basically, in the last year, we've had 4 patches that do fixes, but also add support for new platforms. So kind of the best example would be the prior behavior, and then basically mid-product, aka Veeam version 7, they had a hotfix that brought in SQL 2014 support. I would not expect anything different when it comes to Exchange.
Okay, so it sounds like you're managing to keep pace anyway.
Yeah, we're doing a good job. I mean, the major platforms like Hyper-V 2012 R2, Windows Server 2012 R2, vSphere 5.5, we were able to support those, I believe, within 60 days of them being generally available.
That comment just underlines one of the difficulties that Paul and I discussed the other day, because just a little while ago, because if it's you're a major vendor, you're a major part of a lot of people's infrastructure, and it's taking you 60 days to get up to speed for a new version of Exchange, like a cumulative update. Yet Microsoft are saying to everybody,
every 90 days.
Every 90 days.
Whether you want it or not, we're giving you a new update that you have to be on to be supportable. So that makes it very challenging.
It's a great example. So anyway, listen, Rick, that just about the end of our time with you. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for telling us about the stuff you guys are doing at Veeam. I think you do some great stuff for the virtualization community, and I wish you success in the future.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure catching up with you guys again.
Okay.
Glad to have you, Rick. Speak to you soon.
Yep. So that was some interesting stuff, but let's get back to connections. I guess people looked at the announcement that Microsoft made a little while ago that they were going to hold this Uber technology event in Chicago next May to replace TechEd and MEC and the Link conference and SharePoint and all the rest of it. And I'm kind of wondering, is there still a role for independent conferences like Connections? I mean, what's your view on
Well,
that?
so let me answer that question with a piece of data that I only recently became aware of. The Microsoft conference, and no one knows what to call it, but I'm just going to keep calling it TechEd since that's certainly what it looks like from this vantage point.
Okay.
Microsoft conference is being held at McCormick Center, which is a very, very large convention center. They routinely host conventions that have 50, 60, 70,000 people. They have very few small breakout rooms. Almost all of their spaces are large ballroom-style spaces that are meant to hold hundreds of people. That doesn't sound like that's compatible with the focus on narrow, deep technical topics that we've come to expect from Microsoft's product-focused conferences like MEC.
Okay.
And that's exactly what Connections is supposed to deliver,
Yeah.
where you get in a room with people who know a technology very well, and can speak to it in depth, and can tell you not necessarily what the technology is intended to do, not necessarily what Microsoft publicizes the technology as being good or bad at, but what it's like in the real world. And I think that it's going to be very hard for Microsoft to deliver that level of content and engagement if we're talking about doing it with 300 or 400 attendees per topic. Now, it could be that they have plans to break things up a little differently, but that doesn't diminish from the fact that there's a lot of value in having people who aren't beholden to Microsoft be able to discuss these topics. I think that's critical.
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things that I've observed about this Connections event is that, we have Microsoft people on the schedule, but they're a little independent. They're independent speakers because they come from the product support side. You know, the guys who actually deal with real topics rather than engineers. And for the rest of the time, we've just focused on independent experts who give that real world view of what's going on. I just don't know if it's going to happen at this big conference. I just imagine it's going to be huge, and it's going to be really difficult for the communities like SharePoint and Link and Exchange just to find their own identity in a mass like that.
You know, I think there are a couple different ways that you can look at that as a problem that Microsoft has an opportunity to solve. One is just scale.
Yep.
SharePoint conference had, 8,000 or 9,000 attendees. Link conference had about 2,000. MEC had 2,000. If you add those numbers up and then subtract some percentage for cases where, as Rick said, you have IT generalists who want to go to some sessions from each product, you're still talking about 15,000 people maybe.
Yeah.
That's a large-scale event from a logistical perspective, and it's going to be hard.
Lots of bus riding.
Lots of bus riding, lots of coordination. What happens when you have a speaker, and we saw this both at Link Conference and at MEC, and here at Connections. If you have a speaker who can speak intelligently to multiple topic areas, how are you going to allocate their time? What if they proposed sessions on two distinct technologies that they both have expertise in? Then there's just, something I'm always mindful of when I go to large conventions. You have to wait in line for the bathroom. You have to wait in line for coffee. You have to wait in line to eat. You have to wait in line to get on the bus.
You're not a patient type of person, Paul.
I'm not. I make no secret of that.
Okay. Well, actually, more seriously, I was just talking to a guy, I think it was on Monday night, who's a senior vice president of a large financial institution, and who said the biggest problem that they've got with this big conference is that they're not going to be able to send people. They need to have people who stay at home running the business while the other guys go to the conferences. So whereas in the past they were able to divide across Exchange, Link, SharePoint and TechEd and Connections, now they're going to be able to send maybe a quarter of the total technical staff to this big conference, and that's it.
There's a benefit to Microsoft of having these separate conferences too that I think they may be giving up unnecessarily. Remember that when we saw for the first time the features that are now named Delve, they were introduced at the SharePoint conference.
Yeah.
So Microsoft had SharePoint conference and Link conference and MEC and two TechEds at least. There were all points in time when they could disclose new features.
Yes.
So they had a great deal more flexibility. If they're moving to a model where they have one big conference every year, what does that say about their ability or their flexibility to talk about and launch revisions or updates to products without doing it in a big scripted on-stage launch. Maybe that means we're going to see more of what we saw with Gurdeep's Skype and Link update. When, for example, he demoed the Skype translator.
Yeah.
Maybe now what we're going to see is small launch events in San Francisco or New York or other cities that are not tied to Microsoft's traditional venues.
And then have a one a year come together of the technical community to celebrate all
Maybe
of
so.
these.
I mean, it's an opportunity for Microsoft to reboot everything about the way they do these conferences.
Yes.
And I know a lot of the people I've talked to are maybe fearful is not quite the right word. They're concerned that that reboot is going to throw away some of what was best about the product-specific conferences, including, we're already seeing this at Tech Ed Europe. There, out of the entire speaker base, are 2 MVPs?
Yeah, for Exchange.
For Exchange.
Yes.
That's very, very low participation by historical standards
Yes.
from a community that prides itself on being independent to a fault. And so when I look at Microsoft's consolidated conference, I have to wonder, are they going to be able to preserve a space for independent voices?
Well, I certainly hope it's not going to be an opportunity for a marketing fest of Kool-Aid absorption. That's all I hope.
Do you have something against Kool-Aid?
I just don't like it very much.
That would qualify.
Anyway, you know what? We're getting towards the end of our hour. It's about time to wrap up. We've been through a lot of stuff. We've been through what we think about the current version of Exchange, which they've got some issues. Room for improvement. We know the CU7's coming. We expect to see that in November. We got Exchange 2016, a new version looking to look forward to next year, and we hope that we're going to see some surprises there.
Some
good surprises.
Right.
We might have a new version of Outlook as well to look forward to there, most likely, and hopefully that'll integrate some of these applications that are now coming to the fore, like Delve.
Oh, and Mac Outlook, I'm looking at you. It's time for a new version.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife gives me such grief about Mac Outlook. I cannot tell you. Anyway, that's another story for another day. We're not going there. But I guess, at the end of the day, what the entire Exchange community would just like is a little bit of stability.
Well, yes. Rick made a good point earlier in talking about how important to the business Exchange is.
Yes.
For many, many companies, even ones that don't handle email as their primary line of business, any interruption in service to Exchange is a critical problem. And any change to the software or change to the infrastructure that raises the possibility of having those kinds of problems more frequently is going to generate a lot of discontent in the community.
So let's get some stability. That's all we're asking you, Microsoft.
Yep.
Please give us back our stability.
Give it back to us.
Yes.
We had it before and we miss it.
So with that, I think we're all set. We close off this podcast. We talk to you guys again in 3 months. Hopefully we will have the stability then. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for the Exchange Exposed podcast.